I'm Joe from Statsig. We're a feature flagging and experimentation company. With the rise of generative AI models, we've been seeing a lot of companies leverage the technology to deliver new and innovative features to their customers. Today, we'll be going through how these AI companies leverage Statsig to test their features online and increase their experiment velocity by 10x. Over the last few months, our customer conversations on AI experimentation have increased dramatically. They're looking at the introduction of AI into their products as more of a paradigm shift. And in order to get the most out of the potential that AI unlocks, they've really leaned onto two core values. Firstly, that experimentation is really the key to understanding what AI can do for your product and your business, and that increasing the velocity of experimentation is the key to understanding this impact faster. Additionally, gating every feature in this process helps control user experiences and make sure that users are getting the best version of your product at all times. Historically, companies have tested their AI models through offline methods, such as testing on historical data sets. However, these offline models don't provide insights on how changes affect real-world users. As AI models become increasingly complex, it becomes increasingly important to measure the real-world impact of changes on real users to make sure that there are no unintended consequences. We are currently supporting many customers through this journey and building AI features of our own into our product. With Statsig's experimentation platform, we make it easy for you to set up and run tests on your AI features. With Statsig Feature Gates, you can progressively roll out your AI changes and validate changes before rolling out to a broader set of users. We also enable experimentation across many variants and parameters, each with across all your metrics with our advanced stats engine. To better illustrate this, we'll now run through an experiment that we set up on a sample project here. Okay, so to demonstrate this, we'll show you how to run an example using our demo app here, StatSed. So StatSed is an app that uses OpenAPI to generate responses to questions that users might have about Statsig. So for example here, we can ask, how can Statsig help me with running an experiment? StatSed is using OpenAI's completion APIs to actually generate a response to this query. So as you can see here, we've got a response saying that Statsig can help you with running an experiment by providing you with feature gating and experimentation platform. Great. So the OpenAI API actually has many parameters that you can pass into it that will change the output of the response that it gives you. So for example here, the OpenAI API specifies that you can pass in max tokens, which will change the size of the generated response, and temperature, which controls how random the response will be. So let's say that we have a hypothesis that longer and more random responses will be better for our users. So in this case, we can actually run an experiment on different max tokens and temperature parameter values. To do this, we'll go into the Statsig console here and create an experiment. You can do this inside the Experiments tab of the Statsig console. So here we can create a new experiment. We'll call it temp and max tokens and give a hypothesis about what we think will happen in this experiment. So in this case, we think that longer, more random responses will be better for users. Great, and now we can create the experiment. After creating the experiment, it will be placed into the Experiment Setup tab. In the Experiment Setup tab, we can control the groups, experiment groups, and the experiment parameters. So in this case, we can see through this chart that 100% of the users will be put into the experiment, and then for all the users, they'll be split 50-50 into either a control or test group. We can add more groups, but for simplicity, we'll just keep it to control and test. We'll now also be able to specify our experiment parameters. So in this case, we'll be testing against temperature, which is a number, and also max tokens. which is also a number. In our control experience, our temperature is currently 0 and our max tokens is set to 256. Since we want a more random and longer response in our test group, we'll set the temperature to 1 and our max tokens to 512 to double the potential length of the response generated. We can now save this experiment. So now we can actually go into code and use the experiment when actually generating the parameters that pass into OpenAI APIs. So as you can see here, we're using the Statsig React SDK to grab the experiment, temperature, and max tokens. We're also grabbing the experiment parameters temperature here and max tokens to pass into the OpenAI completion APIs before getting the response. One other thing that we'll set up now is logging product metrics and also infrastructure metrics. So as you can see, we're logging different properties of the OpenAI response. So in this case, the response time, which will be good to measure the latency that users are receiving inside the app, and also the finish reason, which will be a good measure of how many errors users saw. We'll also be logging the number of tokens that were consumed in the response, which will be a good measure of the cost for each of our experiment variants. We can also log product metrics. So in this case, we can see here, there was a "Was this helpful" button at the bottom of the app. And we'll be logging whether the user felt that the response was helpful or not helpful, which will help guide us in making decisions on whether we should ship or not ship the different experiment groups. Going back into another experiment that I've already set up and ran, we can see inside the diagnostics tab that after starting the experiment and starting to run checks against it, you can start seeing different users that are experiencing your different test groups. So in this case, you can see that the user with ID 30178 was put into the test group. We'll also be able to see a real-time stream of different events that are coming in. So for example, the user with ID 79209 got a response time of almost 8 seconds, which is pretty slow, which is also expected given that we're using GPT-4 here, a slower model. After running the experiment for a while, you'll be able to get experiment results. As a sample of an experiment readout, we have here what the view would look like. So let's say for an experiment where we're running GPT-4 versus GPT 3.5, we can see that as some sample results, thumbs up has gone up, thumbs down has gone down, which is demonstrating that GPT-4 is generating better responses for our users than GPT 3.5. The latency has gone up, which is slowing the experience down for our users. Great. So we ran through how to actually set up an experiment and getting results. What if inside your experiment you want to control who gets to see the experience? Going back into the experiment setup, we can see that inside the groups and parameters setup, there's a way to set targeting on users. So let's say that you want to control your rollout and only allow certain users in different countries see the experience. In this case, you can create a targeting gate. We'll name ours temp and max tokens rollout and create it. We'll now be able to specify rules about who can actually see the experiment. So in this case, if we want to only allow users in the US to see the experience, we can name this rule US only and specify a country criteria where only users who are in the US will be able to see the experiment. We can now save this. And now for any users that are not in the US, they will be put into the default of fail and receive default values for the experience. So for example, going back into code, you can see that we set default values for experiment parameters here, temperature of 0 and max tokens of 256. So they will be receiving that experience and also not being put into the experiment results. I'll run through one last feature that will be useful for increasing your experiment velocity, which is our layers product. Layers allow you to run multiple mutually exclusive experiments at once and pull the experiment parameters into the layer level so you can reuse them across all the different experiments within the layer. So for example, inside this layer, OpenAI model params, we can see that there are 4 different parameter sets: model, temperature, max tokens, and prompt lead up. Now we can create many different experiments within this layer and reuse the parameters that are defined within this layer and not need to change the code. So for example, if we want to run one other experiment within this product, we would actually have to go into the code and change the experiment that was being called. But instead, now we can use the use layer API with the layer that we created. So in this case, OpenAI model params, and grab the layer that was returned from the response and grab all the parameters from the layer instead of from the experiment. Now we can run many different experiments at once on different parameters. So for example, here we can create a new experiment, let's say on model. In this case, actually use the parameter, the layer parameter. So in this case, it would be model. And let's say we want to test DaVinci 3 versus text DaVinci 2. We start running this experiment. Now users who are put into this experiment within the layer will now be receiving the one of these 2 test groups and now be put into this experience. Notice that we didn't have to change any code here to actually be running this experiment, since we're grabbing the experiment parameters from the layer. We've shown here that to get the most out of experimentation when building with AI, you should launch your AI-powered features progressively via rollouts and log all core AI and product metrics in order to understand impact across the whole stack. Also, begin to run all experiments with different versions of model and parameters to make sure that you find the most optimal version of the AI feature for your product. AI is a fast-evolving industry, and we're seeing new models and technologies pop up constantly. Statsig's easy-to-use platform allows you to keep up with the industry, and we're constantly exploring options to make the experience better. If you're building AI features and want to start running experiments, you can check out our Microsoft Commercial Marketplace listing to learn more.